May 23, 1942, 6 kilometers west of Gazala, Libya. The captured American vehicle sat in the sand like a mechanical insult, its olive green paint already dulling under the relentless North African sun. Oberst Ludwig Hartmann walked around it slowly, hands clasped behind his back, his polished boots leaving precise impressions in the sand. The heat shimmered off the metal hood. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled, a low, constant thunder that had become the soundtrack of the Desert War. Hartmann stopped, squinted at the crude lines of the vehicle, and felt something close to pity. This was what the Americans sent to war. The Jeep, they called it a Jeep, a word as ungainly as the machine itself, looked like something assembled by children playing at engineering. No elegance, no refinement, just flat surfaces welded together with all the aesthetic consideration of a shipping crate. Hartmann had seen the technical reports from Berlin, read the assessments that confirmed what every officer of the Wehrmacht already knew. American industry was vast but primitive, capable of producing quantity but utterly incapable of matching German quality. This vehicle before him seemed to embody that weakness perfectly. "Hauptmann Miller," Hartmann called out, not taking his eyes off the Jeep. "What do you make of it?" Friedrich Miller approached from the shade of a supply tent, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief already stained brown with desert dust. At 31, Miller was the Afrika Korps' most promising mechanical engineer, a man who could disassemble a Panzer transmission blindfolded and reassemble it faster than most men could change a tire. He had been summoned specifically to evaluate this American curiosity. "Crude, Herr Oberst," Miller said, walking around the vehicle with the critical eye of a jeweler examining a counterfeit stone. "The welds are rough. The body panels are flat steel, not the compound curves of the Kübelwagen. No aerodynamic considerations whatsoever. And look at this." He tapped the hood with his knuckle. "Thin. Flimsy. This wouldn't stop a rifle bullet." Hartmann nodded. It confirmed everything. The Kübelwagen, Germany's versatile military vehicle, was a triumph of engineering, lightweight, efficient, perfectly adapted to the requirements of modern warfare. Its design reflected years of careful refinement, the kind of meticulous German engineering that had made the Reich's military machine the most formidable on Earth. This American contraption, by contrast, looked like something a farmer might cobble together in a barn. "How was it captured?" Miller asked. Reconnaissance patrol encountered an American supply column near Tobruk. Brief engagement. The Americans abandoned their vehicles and fled. Hartmann allowed himself a thin smile. Rather telling, wouldn't you say? What Hartmann didn't mention, what he didn't yet know, was that the Americans had withdrawn tactically, that their orders had been to avoid engagement, that they had accomplished their mission of identifying German positions. The Jeep had been left behind not out of panic, but because its crew had transferred to another vehicle when theirs sustained minor damage. But in May of 1942, with Rommel's Afrika Korps driving the British back across Libya and Nazi propaganda trumpeting the inevitable victory of German arms, such nuances seemed irrelevant. Hartmann had been a career officer for 18 years. He had served in the Great War as a young lieutenant, had survived the chaos of Weimar, had rebuilt his career in the new Wehrmacht. He had seen the Blitzkrieg roll across Poland, had watched German panzers knife through French defenses that were supposed to be impregnable. He had learned through years of experience and the evidence of victory after victory that German military technology was simply superior. It was not nationalism. It was not propaganda. It was observable fact. The Kübelwagen proved it. Designed by Ferdinand Porsche himself, based on the Volkswagen chassis, it was a masterpiece of efficient engineering. Its rear-wheel drive was sufficient for most terrain. Its air-cooled engine required less maintenance than water-cooled designs. Its 25-horsepower engine sipped fuel, a critical advantage in the desert where every liter of gasoline had to be transported across the Mediterranean, then trucked hundreds of kilometers from Tripoli. The Kübelwagen was what happened when German precision met military necessity. And this American Jeep? Hartmann circled it again, noting every crude detail. The flat windshield that could fold down. Why would you need that? The exposed engine compartment with its simple four-cylinder design. Where was the sophistication? The oversized tires that seemed comically large for such a small vehicle, inefficient surely. Everything about it spoke of haste, of carelessness, of a nation that didn't understand the first principles of military engineering. "Shall we conduct a full technical evaluation, Herr Oberst?" Miller asked. "Yes." "Disassemble it, if necessary. I want a complete report. Engine specifications, transmission design, suspension geometry, everything. Berlin will want to know exactly what the Americans are fielding." Hartman paused, then added with something approaching sarcasm, "Perhaps we'll discover some hidden genius in this creation." Miller smiled. "I doubt that, sir. But I'll be thorough." As Hartman walked back toward his command tent, the Jeep sat silent in the sand. It was a Willys MB, officially designated as a quarter-ton 4x4 truck, though no one called it that. It had been built in Toledo, Ohio, in a factory that was now producing them at the rate of one every 2 minutes. It weighed 2,400 pounds. Its engine displaced 134 cubic inches and generated 60 horsepower at 4,000 revolutions per minute. It could climb a 60-degree slope, ford water 30 inches deep, and carry half a ton of cargo across terrain where horses would struggle. But Oberst Hartman didn't know these specifications yet. More importantly, he didn't understand what they meant. He saw an ugly vehicle built by a nation of mechanics and farmers, a country that had entered the war late and unprepared, a people who understood mass production, but not military excellence. The Jeep before him seemed to confirm every assumption about American inferiority that Nazi propaganda had carefully cultivated. In the tent, Hartman poured himself a cup of ersatz coffee. Real coffee was a distant memory now, and opened his journal. He dated the entry, 23 May 1942. He wrote, "Today examined captured American reconnaissance vehicle. Crude design confirms intelligence assessments regarding American technical capabilities. Full evaluation ordered, but expectations are low. The Kübelwagen remains superior in every measurable respect." He didn't know that he was writing one of the last entries in which he would express complete certainty about German technological superiority. He didn't know that within months everything he believed about American capabilities would shatter like glass struck by a hammer. He didn't know that the ugly little vehicle sitting in the sand outside would become the symbol of everything the Wehrmacht had fatally underestimated about its enemies. The coffee was bitter and left grounds on his tongue. Outside, the desert wind picked up, blowing sand against the canvas walls with a sound like rain. Somewhere to the east, the British were regrouping, preparing for another offensive. Somewhere across the Atlantic, in factories that Hartman couldn't imagine, America was awakening to war production on a scale that would have seemed like fantasy if anyone had described it to him. But in that moment, drinking bad coffee in a tent in the Libyan desert, Ludwig Hartmann was certain of German superiority. The Jeep was just another piece of evidence, nothing more. He had no idea how wrong he was. November 7th, 1942. Captured British depot, 60 kilometers south of El Alamein. Hauptmann Miller's hands were black with grease, his uniform jacket discarded in the shade, his shirt sleeves rolled up past his elbows. 6 months had passed since that first captured Jeep at Gazala, and now there were 17 American vehicles scattered across the depot, all in various states of repair and disassembly. The British retreat after Montgomery's offensive had left behind a treasure trove of equipment, and among the British trucks and American Lend-Lease tanks, the Jeeps stood out. They shouldn't have. Miller had completed his initial technical evaluation in June, writing a report that concluded, as expected, that the Willys MB was a crude but functional design, inferior to German equipment in most respects. He had noted its simplicity with condescension, its lack of refinement with barely concealed contempt. Berlin had filed his report alongside dozens of others documenting captured enemy equipment. No one had paid much attention. But something had been nagging at Miller for months now. Something that didn't fit the narrative. The Jeeps kept working, not just working, thriving. Where Kübelwagens required careful maintenance, precise attention to their air-cooled engines, regular adjustments to their rear-wheel drive systems, the Jeeps simply continued. Day after day, week after week, through sandstorms that choked other engines, through heat that cracked cylinder heads, through terrain that should have destroyed their suspensions. Obergefreiter Hans Weber, a mechanic from Munich who had been maintaining vehicles in North Africa for 14 months, squatted beside one of the jeeps, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He was 34, too old for the infantry, with the thick hands and permanent dirt under his fingernails of someone who had worked with machines his entire life. Before the war, he had owned a small garage. Now he kept the Afrika Korps vehicles running in conditions that no garage in Munich had ever prepared him for. "Hauptmann," Weber said, not looking up from the engine block he was examining, "you need to see this." Miller walked over, wiping his hands on a rag that only redistributed the grease. "What am I looking at?" "Parts." Weber gestured at the disassembled components laid out on a tarp. "Every single part in this engine is identical to every other Jeep we've captured. Not similar, identical. Same bolt threads, same gasket dimensions, same everything." "Standardization," Miller said. "That's not remarkable." "No, sir. It's more than that." Weber stood up, his knees cracking. "It's perfect standardization. I can take a carburetor from that Jeep," he pointed to a vehicle 30 meters away, "and install it in this one in 10 minutes. No adjustments, no modifications. It just fits. Works immediately." Miller frowned. This was exactly the kind of crude mass production he expected from Americans. Quantity over quality. Make everything the same to speed production. But Weber's tone suggested something else, something that Miller hadn't quite grasped yet. "The Kübelwagen has standardized parts," Miller said. "Yes, sir." "Theoretically." Weber's expression was carefully neutral. "But in practice? Every unit has slight variations, different suppliers, different tolerances. You have to file things down, make adjustments. It takes time, skill." He paused. "With these American machines, there's no skill required. Any idiot can swap parts. It's all designed for idiots." Miller heard the implicit criticism in Weber's words, though Weber was too disciplined to voice it directly. Designed for idiots? Or designed so brilliantly simple that idiots couldn't break it? There was a difference, and Miller was beginning to suspect which interpretation was correct. "Show me the four-wheel drive system again," Miller said. Weber led him to another Jeep, this one with its transfer case exposed. The mechanism was embarrassingly simple, a set of gears that could redirect power from the rear axle to both axles, activated by a lever in the cabin. No complex hydraulics, no sophisticated controls. Just mechanical directness. "Engage four-wheel drive, shift to low range, and it'll climb anything," Weber said. "We tested it on that dune over there." He pointed to a slope of loose sand rising at least 45 degrees. The Kübelwagen got halfway up, and the rear wheels just spun, dug itself in. The Jeep drove to the top. Slowly, yes, but it made it. First try. Miller had witnessed this test himself. He had watched, feeling something uncomfortable twist in his stomach, as the Jeep, overloaded with gear, driven by a private who had never operated it before, ground its way up a slope that had defeated German vehicles. The sound of its engine had been almost insulting, a low mechanical growl that seemed to mock the sophisticated whine of German engineering. "It's the weight distribution," Miller had said at the time, "lower center of gravity." But that wasn't the whole answer, and he knew it. The Jeep weighed more than a Kübelwagen. Its center of gravity wasn't notably lower. The difference was the four-wheel drive, the way power transferred to whichever wheels had traction, the low gear ratio that let it crawl over obstacles at walking speed with enough torque to move a small building. "There's something else, Hauptmann," Weber said, his voice dropping. "The engine. 60 horsepower." Miller nodded. He knew the specifications. The Jeep's Go Devil engine produced 60 horsepower compared to the Kübelwagen's 25. This had been in his original report, noted as evidence of American wastefulness. Why put such a large engine in such a small vehicle? It was inefficient, unnecessary, except it wasn't unnecessary, not in the desert, not when you needed to carry 4 men plus equipment through soft sand in 120-degree heat. The Kübelwagen's air-cooled engine, so efficient in theory, struggled in the relentless African sun. It overheated. It lost power. It required constant attention. The Jeep's water-cooled engine, primitive as it seemed, simply kept running. "I've been keeping notes," Weber said quietly, glancing around to ensure no officers besides Miller were within earshot. "Maintenance hours per vehicle per month. The Kübelwagen averages 42 hours. The Jeeps? 14. Miller stared at him. "That can't be right." "It is, sir. I've checked it 3 times. Weber pulled a folded paper from his pocket, a grid of penciled numbers. "Oil changes, minor repairs, adjustments. The Kübelwagens need constant care. The Jeeps? You check the fluids, change the oil, and they keep going. The design is so simple there's almost nothing to break." This was dangerous thinking. Not politically dangerous, not yet, but dangerous to Muller's entire understanding of engineering excellence. He had been trained to believe that sophistication was superior, that complexity managed correctly produced better performance than crude simplicity. The Kübelwagen embodied that philosophy. Every component was carefully designed, precisely manufactured, intended to work in harmony with every other component. It was beautiful engineering. The Jeep was none of those things. It was agricultural, brutalist. Every component oversized and overbuilt, designed not for elegance, but for survival. Looking at its engine was like looking at a piece of farm equipment. Thick metal, wide tolerances, nothing remotely clever. And yet... "How many Jeeps have we captured now?" Miller asked. 47 as of last week, Weber said. "Most from British units, some directly from Americans." "And Hauptmann," Weber's voice dropped even lower, "there's a black market." "What?" "Officers are trading for them, unofficially. A working Jeep is worth more than its weight in equipment. Everyone wants one. They're faster than our motorcycles, more reliable than our reconnaissance vehicles, and they can go places our trucks can't reach." Weber paused. "I've heard Panzer commanders offering cases of schnapps for a captured Jeep." Miller felt something cold settle in his chest. This was more than just technical evaluation now. This was frontline soldiers, practical men who cared nothing for theory, voting with their actions. If Wehrmacht officers were competing for captured American vehicles, if they valued Jeeps more than German equipment, then something fundamental was wrong with the official assessment. That night, Miller sat in his tent with a kerosene lamp casting shadows on canvas walls, writing in his personal journal. Not an official report, just his own thoughts. He wrote, "We have been telling ourselves that American industry is primitive, that they produce quantity without quality. But what if we have been measuring quality incorrectly? What if true quality is not sophistication but reliability, not elegance but functionality? The Jeep is not a sophisticated vehicle, but it is perhaps the most practical military vehicle I have ever encountered. This is troubling." He didn't show this entry to anyone. He certainly didn't include such thoughts in his official reports. To question German engineering superiority was to question the fundamental narrative of the war, that German quality would triumph over Allied quantity, that superior training and equipment would defeat mere numbers. But the numbers were beginning to tell a different story. By late 1942, Willys and Ford were producing Jeeps at a combined rate of 30,000 per month. The Kübelwagen factory in Fallersleben was producing perhaps 4,000 in the same period. A 7-to-1 ratio. And if the Jeeps lasted 3 times longer, with 1/3 the maintenance, Miller closed his journal and extinguished the lamp. In the darkness he could hear the sounds of the depot, the clink of tools, the low voices of mechanics working through the night, and somewhere in the distance, the distinctive sound of a Jeep engine starting, that rough American growl that he was beginning to recognize immediately, the way you recognize a voice. He tried to sleep, but couldn't. Something had shifted in his understanding, a fundamental assumption cracking under the weight of accumulated evidence. He had been trained to believe that German engineering represented the pinnacle of technical achievement. But what if the Americans, with their crude designs and mass production, had accidentally discovered something that German engineers, in all their sophistication, had missed? What if simplicity was genius? February 19, 1943, Wehrmacht prison camp, southern Tunisia. Oberst Ludwig Hartmann had been wounded 3 days earlier during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, and for 20 hours he had believed he would die. The American artillery shell had landed 6 meters from his command vehicle, close enough that the concussion threw him against the metal frame, close enough that a fragment of shrapnel, a piece of steel the size of a postage stamp, had entered his abdomen just below his ribs. He remembered the moment of impact as an abstract thing, almost painless at first, just a strange pulling sensation, and then heat. Then the pain had arrived, white and absolute, and he had fallen. His driver, Gefreiter Klein, had dragged him into cover while artillery continued to pound the ravine. Klein had applied field dressings, pressed morphine syrettes into Hartmann's thigh, whispered reassurances that the Hauptmann would find him, that a medical vehicle was coming. But the American advance had been too rapid. The Wehrmacht forces at Kasserine had been overrun before medics could reach their position. Hartmann had spent a day and a night in a shallow cave, drifting in and out of consciousness, feeling infection spread through his body like slow fire. When the American patrol found them the next morning, Hartmann had been certain they would be shot. He had heard the propaganda about American brutality, about how their mongrel army of immigrants and Negroes lacked the discipline and honor of professional soldiers. He had expected a bullet, perhaps preceded by mockery or abuse. What he hadn't expected was efficiency. The American medic, a corporal with a Tennessee accent so thick Hartmann could barely understand his English, had examined the wound, given Hartmann a shot of something that made the pain recede to a distant throb, and called for immediate evacuation. Within 30 minutes, Hartmann had been loaded into an ambulance, not a German-style ambulance, carefully designed and precisely engineered. An American ambulance converted from a Dodge truck chassis, rough and loud, and apparently indestructible, and the vehicle that led the ambulance back to American lines, a Jeep. Through his morphine haze, Hartmann had watched that Jeep navigate terrain that should have been impossible for a wheeled vehicle. Rocky slopes, deep sand. A stream crossing that left everyone else soaked but didn't slow the Jeep at all. The driver, a private who looked impossibly young, handled the vehicle with casual competence, one hand on the wheel, the other adjusting the transfer case lever when terrain required extra traction. The Jeep bounced and jolted but never faltered, its suspension absorbing impacts that would have broken axles on a Kubelwagen. 9 months had passed since Hartmann had first examined a captured Jeep at Gazala. 9 months during which his certainty about German superiority had eroded like sand in wind, not dramatically but relentlessly, grain by grain. He had watched Jeeps operate throughout the North African campaign. He had seen them haul supplies through terrain where German trucks bogged down. He had witnessed them serve as ambulances, reconnaissance vehicles, command cars, weapons platforms, adapting to every need with frustrating versatility. And now one was saving his life. The American field hospital had been set up in a requisitioned farmhouse complex near Feriana. When Hartmann was carried inside, he experienced his second profound shock. There was no queue, no line of wounded men waiting for treatment while doctors prioritized the most salvageable cases. Instead, he was immediately placed on a surgical table, his uniform cut away, his wound cleaned and examined by a surgeon who looked at him with professional detachment and said, "Sepsis? Peritonitis. He needs surgery now." "But there must be American wounded," Hartmann managed to say in halting English. "They should receive priority." The surgeon, a major named Carson with graying hair and steady hands, looked at him with an expression Hartmann couldn't quite parse. "We treat patients in order of medical necessity, Colonel. Your nationality is irrelevant to your wound." It was a statement so simple it seemed meaningless. But as Hartmann was put under with ether, as consciousness dissolved into chemical darkness, he understood that he had just encountered something more shocking than the Jeep's capabilities. He had encountered American abundance applied to medicine. They had enough doctors, enough supplies, enough organizational capacity that they didn't need to triage by nationality. They could afford to treat everyone. He woke 12 hours later in a recovery ward, a tent with 20 cots, half occupied by wounded Americans, half by wounded Germans and Italians. His abdomen was bandaged, a drainage tube protruded from his side, and the pain had been reduced to a deep ache. He was alive. The sepsis that should have killed him had been stopped by antibiotics, American sulfa drugs that German forces had only in limited quantities. A nurse, a lieutenant with a Boston accent, checked his pulse, examined his bandages, made notes on a clipboard. "You're lucky," she said. "Another 6 hours and the peritonitis would have been irreversible. You'd have died." "Why did you save me?" Hartman asked. The morphine made him honest. "You should have let me die. One less German to fight." She looked at him with an expression somewhere between pity and impatience. "We're not barbarians, Colonel. We're doctors and nurses. We save lives. That's what we do." She adjusted his IV drip. "Get some rest. You've got a long recovery ahead." The man in the cot next to Hartman's was an American lieutenant named Morrison, missing his left leg below the knee, casualty of a mine. Over the following days, as both men recovered, or in Morrison's case, learned to accept what recovery meant now, they talked. Hartman's English was adequate, Morrison's German non-existent, so they conversed in Hartman's second language, and slowly, through fragments of conversation, Hartman began to understand what he was witnessing. "How many of these hospitals do you have?" Hartman asked one afternoon. Morrison shrugged. "No idea." "Dozens?" "Hundreds. We've got hospital ships, field hospitals, evacuation hospitals, general hospitals. The Army Medical Corps is its own massive operation." "Why?" "In the Wehrmacht," Hartman said slowly, "we have field hospitals. But nothing like this. Nothing so extensive." "Yeah, well," Morrison adjusted himself on the cot, grimacing. "That's America for you. We don't do anything halfway. If we're going to war, we're going to do it with more of everything. More trucks, more tanks, more hospitals, more everything. More of everything." Hartman had heard this phrase before, usually in the context of mockery. The Americans with their crude abundance, their belief that quantity could substitute for quality. But lying in an American field hospital, alive because of American organizational capacity and medical supplies, the mockery seemed hollow. "The Jeep," Hartman said, changing the subject, but not really. "Your soldiers use them for everything." Morrison laughed. "The Jeep's the best thing we've got. Reliable as sunrise. You can drive it through hell, park it for a month, come back, and it'll start on the first try. I've seen guys roll them, flip them completely over, and they just flip them back and keep driving." "We captured one," Hartman said, "in May, last year, at Gazala. We examined it. We concluded it was crude." "It is crude," Morrison agreed cheerfully. "That's why it's perfect. Nothing fancy to break. Just solid American engineering. Make it simple. Make it strong. Make 10 million of them. 10 million. Hartman didn't know if that number was accurate or hyperbole, but the principle was clear. Americans didn't try to make the perfect vehicle. They made a good enough vehicle and manufactured it in quantities that made perfection irrelevant. And it wasn't just Jeeps. Over the weeks of his recovery, Hartman observed the American military operation with the analytical eye of a career officer. He saw their logistics, trucks arriving daily with supplies, food in such abundance that even prisoners ate well. He saw their equipment maintenance, mechanics swarming over vehicles with spare parts that seemed infinite. He saw their medical supplies, sulfa drugs, plasma, bandages, morphine, everything organized and cataloged and available. He saw what he should have seen 9 months earlier at Gazala. America was not primitive. America was frightening. One afternoon, a week before he was to be transferred to a permanent POW camp in Algeria, Hartman was well enough to walk around the compound. He found himself near the motor pool where American mechanics worked on vehicles. And there, among the trucks and ambulances, was a collection of Jeeps in various states of repair. He watched a young mechanic, not even a specialist, just a private with motor pool duty, replace an entire engine in under 4 hours. Just unbolted the old one, lifted it out, dropped in the new one, connected everything, and the Jeep started immediately. Hauptmann Miller would have found this scene deeply troubling, Hartman thought. All that careful German engineering, all that precision and sophistication being outperformed by agricultural simplicity and industrial abundance. A sergeant noticed Hartman watching and walked over. "You interested in Jeeps, Colonel?" "I examined one once," Hartman said. "When we captured it. I thought it was primitive." The sergeant grinned. "It is primitive. That's the beauty of it. The thing's designed like a tractor." You know why Ford and Willys can make them so fast? Because there's nothing complicated to manufacture. Flat panels. Simple engine. Everything oversized, so tolerances don't matter. It's genius disguised as stupidity. Genius disguised as stupidity. Hartman felt something click into place, a final piece of understanding that had been eluding him. German engineering had pursued sophistication, complex solutions elegantly executed. American engineering had pursued reliability, simple solutions produced in overwhelming quantity. And in the context of total war, where equipment needed to be manufactured by the millions and maintained by barely trained conscripts in impossible conditions, simplicity was winning. "We're producing one every 2 minutes now," the sergeant continued, 16 hours a day at the Toledo plant, maybe 12 hours at the Ford plant. By the time this war's over, there'll be a Jeep for every 10 Americans in uniform. One every 2 minutes. Hartman did the mathematics in his head. 30 per hour, 720 per day, 250,000 per year. Multiply that by 2 factories, account for Ford's additional production, and America was manufacturing perhaps 500,000 Jeeps annually. Germany's entire Kübelwagen production for the entire war might reach 50,000, a 10-to-1 ratio. And that was just one type of vehicle. "How many tanks are you producing?" Hartman heard himself ask. "Tanks?" The sergeant laughed. "Brother, we're making tanks like sausages. Shermans roll off the line at Chrysler, Fisher, Ford, all of them. Couple thousand a month, maybe. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's a lot. A couple thousand per month. Germany's entire tank production was perhaps 500 monthly, a 4-to-1 ratio, and American tanks, while not superior to German Tigers or Panthers, were good enough. That was the American philosophy. Good enough in overwhelming numbers would defeat perfect in limited quantities. That night in his cot, Hartman wrote a letter to his wife that the censors would never allow to pass. He wrote, "My dearest Helena, I have seen the future and it is American. Not because they are better soldiers, they are not. Not because their equipment is superior, it is not always. But because they have so much of everything that our superiority in quality cannot compensate for their superiority in quantity. We are fighting an opponent who can afford to treat enemy wounded as well as their own, who can manufacture vehicles faster than we can destroy them, who waste more material in a day than we produce in a week. This is not war as we understand it. This is industrial mathematics, and the mathematics favor America." He folded the letter and placed it in his journal, unsent. Saying such things was dangerous, possibly treasonous, but the truth was the truth, whether spoken or not. 2 days later, he was transferred to a POW camp in Algeria, transported in a convoy of trucks led by, inevitably, a Jeep. He watched that Jeep for the entire journey, memorizing its movements, its capabilities, its brutal efficiency. The driver never had to slow down for terrain. The vehicle never hesitated. It simply went, and everything else followed. December 16, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The snow fell in thick curtains, muffling sound, erasing distinction between earth and sky. In a camouflaged command post dug into a hillside near Malmedy, Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny studied maps by lamplight and wondered if he had finally been assigned an impossible mission. Skorzeny was Hitler's favorite commando, the man who had led the airborne raid to rescue Mussolini from his mountain prison, a giant of a man with a dueling scar on his cheek and a reputation for accomplishing what others considered fantasy. Now he had been ordered to organize Operation Greif, a plan to infiltrate American lines with German soldiers disguised as Americans, spreading confusion and chaos in advance of the Wehrmacht's last great offensive in the West. The plan required vehicles. Specifically, it required American vehicles that could move through American-controlled territory without raising suspicion. And that meant Jeeps. Skorzeny had requested 100 jeeps from captured enemy equipment reserves. High Command had allocated them immediately, pulling vehicles from throughout occupied Europe, scraping together every captured jeep they could find. The fact that German High Command had willingly given him 100 of their most prized captured vehicles spoke volumes about how desperate the situation had become and how valuable those jeeps were considered. In the tent beside him, Hauptsturmführer Karl Rodel was briefing the Operation Greif volunteers, men who spoke English well enough to pass as Americans, who had studied American mannerisms and slang, who would drive into enemy territory dressed in American uniforms and operating American equipment. It was a dangerous mission, arguably illegal under the laws of war. Capture meant certain execution as spies, but they had all volunteered anyway. The vehicles are critical, Radel was saying. You must know them perfectly. The Americans trust their jeeps absolutely. A German vehicle, no matter how well disguised, would be questioned. An American jeep driven confidently will pass through checkpoints unchallenged. Skorzeny walked outside, his boots crunching in fresh snow, and approached the motor pool where the captured jeeps sat in neat rows. 100 vehicles, olive green paint weathered and faded, each bearing the scars of service. Dents, scratches, replaced parts, field repairs. These jeeps had served with British forces, American forces, French resistance fighters. They had been captured, repaired, used by German units, captured again, changed hands half a dozen times. And they still ran. A mechanic, Obergefreiter Thomas Klein, a veteran of the Afrika Korps motor pool, was performing final maintenance checks. Klein was 52, far too old for combat duty, but his skills with engines had kept him in service throughout the war. He had maintained Kübelwagens, captured British trucks, Italian vehicles, and increasingly American equipment. Klein, Skorzeny said, these jeeps, are they reliable? Klein looked up from the engine he was checking, wiped his hands on a rag, and said with absolute certainty, Herr Obersturmbannführer, these are the most reliable vehicles I have ever worked on. More reliable than anything we produce. Coming from a German mechanic, this was an extraordinary statement. Skorzeny studied the man's face for irony or resentment and found neither, just professional assessment. Explain, Skorzeny said. Klein gestured at the jeep beside him. Simple, overbuilt, designed for abuse. The engine is crude but robust. 60 horsepower, water-cooled, tolerances so wide that dirt and sand don't stop it. The four-wheel drive system is mechanical, not hydraulic, so there's nothing sophisticated to fail. Every part is standardized. I can swap components between any of these vehicles without adjustment, and the maintenance requirements are minimal. Change the oil, check the fluids, and they run forever. Forever, Skorzeny repeated skeptically. I have seen jeeps with 200,000 kilometers on the odometer still operating, Klein said. I have never seen a Kübelwagen last that long. Never. Skorzeny ran his hand along the jeep's hood, feeling the cold metal, the slight roughness of weathered paint. This vehicle represented everything he had been taught to despise about American engineering. Its crudeness, its lack of refinement, its agricultural aesthetic. And yet here he was, Germany's most celebrated commando, preparing for the Reich's last desperate offensive, and he had specifically requested American equipment because German vehicles were insufficient for his mission. The irony was almost painful. How many of these jeeps were produced? Skorzeny asked. Approximately 640,000, sir, Klein said. He had clearly studied the subject. 360,000 by Willys, 280,000 by Ford, compared to perhaps 50,000 Kübelwagens total production, a 12-to-1 ratio. Skorzeny did the mathematics automatically. Even if the Jeep was only half as capable as a Kübelwagen, and evidence suggested it was actually more capable, the numerical advantage was overwhelming. For every German reconnaissance vehicle, America had produced 12 Jeeps, and those Jeeps were scattered across every theater of war, performing every imaginable role, simply continuing to function regardless of conditions. Why did we not produce something similar? Skorzeny asked. Klein's expression suggested he had asked himself this question many times. Because we believed sophistication was superior to simplicity, sir. We believed that quality would triumph over quantity. We believed our engineering was the best in the world. and that anything less refined was beneath us. He paused. We were wrong. It was a stunning admission from a man who had devoted his career to German machinery. But Klein was too old and too experienced to maintain comfortable illusions. He had seen too many Kubelwagens break down in critical moments, had jury-rigged too many repairs with inadequate spare parts, had watched too many operations fail because vehicles couldn't reach their destinations. The Americans designed the Jeep for reality, Klein continued, for soldiers who barely understand engines, for terrain that destroys sophisticated equipment, for wars where logistics matter more than individual performance. They made it simple enough that any fool could maintain it, strong enough that abuse wouldn't break it, and cheap enough to manufacture in unlimited quantities. It's not elegant, but it wins wars. Skorzeny turned away, watching snow fall on the rows of silent vehicles. In 3 hours, Operation Greif would begin. His men would drive these American jeeps through the Ardennes, penetrating Allied lines, cutting communication cables, misdirecting traffic, creating the chaos that Germany needed to sustain its offensive. They would rely entirely on captured American equipment because German equipment couldn't accomplish the mission. And that reliance, more than any battlefield defeat, represented the truth about this war. Germany had bet on quality. America had bet on quantity. And quantity, it turned out, had its own quality. Part 5. The Weight of Industrial Mathematics. December 20th, 1944. 4 days into Operation Greif. The American First Army headquarters at Spa, Belgium was in chaos. Reports were flooding in of German soldiers speaking English, wearing American uniforms, driving American vehicles. Roadblocks had been established throughout the rear areas. Military police were interrogating everyone, asking questions about baseball teams and movie stars to identify infiltrators. General Courtney Hodges' staff had tripled his security detail after receiving reports that German commandos were specifically hunting for high-ranking officers. What they didn't know, what Skorzeny's teams had accomplished before being killed or captured, was that one of those teams had successfully cut the communication cable between Hodges' 1st Army headquarters and General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group command post. For 24 critical hours during the initial German offensive, the primary communication link between these commands was severed, forcing reliance on radio and courier systems that were slower and less secure. And the team that had cut that cable had traveled 80 kilometers behind American lines in a captured Jeep, passed through 4 checkpoints unchallenged, completed their sabotage, and escaped 40 kilometers before being intercepted. Their vehicle had been immediately recognizable as American. Their confident handling of it had aroused no suspicion, and the Jeep's reliability had allowed them to cover distances that would have been impossible in German equipment. 3 other Greif teams had achieved similar successes, though most had been captured or killed within 24 hours. But the mere presence of German soldiers in American uniforms driving American vehicles had created paranoia that paralyzed Allied operations for days. Entire divisions slowed their movements to verify identities at checkpoints. Command decisions were delayed by communication disruptions. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last great offensive, gained critical time and space because German commandos had used American jeeps to create chaos. It was the ultimate acknowledgement of the Jeep's superiority. Germany's most elite soldiers on the Reich's most desperate mission had been forced to rely on captured American equipment because German vehicles simply couldn't do the job. By the end of December, most of Skorzeny's men were dead or captured. The Battle of the Bulge had failed, the Wehrmacht's offensive collapsing under its own logistical impossibilities. Germany simply didn't have the fuel, the ammunition, or the vehicles to sustain a major offensive in 1944. The industrial mathematics that had been working against them since America entered the war had become insurmountable. But the Jeep continued. Allied forces advancing into Germany in early 1945 rode in jeeps. Reconnaissance units scouted in jeeps. Artillery observers directed fire from jeeps. Medical teams evacuated wounded in jeeps. Communications teams laid cable from jeeps. The vehicle had become so ubiquitous that it was simply part of the landscape of war, as common and unremarkable as rifles or helmets. May 8, 1945. POW camp, Fort Hood, Texas. Ludwig Hartmann stood in the exercise yard and watched American soldiers drive past in a convoy heading toward the demobilization center. Trucks, ambulances, and jeeps, always jeeps, leading the way, scattered throughout the column everywhere at once. The war in Europe had ended this morning. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. Hartmann was 54 now, grayer than when he had examined that first captured jeep at Gazala 3 years earlier, thinner from prison camp rations, marked by the scar from his abdominal surgery, and by something deeper that didn't show on his body. He had spent 2 years as a prisoner, first in Algeria, then transferred to America itself, that vast country he had never expected to see. And in those 2 years, he had reached an understanding that was both simple and profound. Germany had lost the war in the factories of Detroit and Toledo and Pittsburgh, lost it in the shipyards of California and the aircraft plants of Kansas, lost it in the steel mills and rubber plants and oil refineries that turned America's natural resources into military equipment at a rate that defied comprehension. The actual fighting, the tactics and strategies and individual bravery had almost been irrelevant. The mathematics had been clear from the beginning if anyone had been willing to see it. Hauptmann Müller had survived the war and was in this same prison camp, thinner and quieter but still alive. They had found each other 3 months earlier, and their first conversation had been about the Jeep. "I should have understood in 1942, Müller had said. "When Weber showed me the standardization, the simplicity. I saw it, but I didn't want to believe it." "None of us did," Hartmann had replied. "We believed what we needed to believe. That German quality would triumph. That sophistication was superior to simplicity, that the Americans were primitive." They had walked in silence for a time. Then Müller had said something that Hartmann had been thinking but hadn't articulated. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was a philosophy. American industrial philosophy. Make it simple so anyone can use it. Make it reliable so it doesn't need experts to maintain it. Make it cheap so you can produce unlimited quantities. And overwhelm your enemy with abundance. Abundance. That was the word that summarized everything. America had fought this war with abundance. Abundant food, abundant medical supplies, abundant fuel, abundant equipment. Even their prisoners ate better than German soldiers in the field. The prison camp had a library with thousands of books, a hospital with medications that Germany hadn't seen since 1941, workshops where prisoners could learn trades. It was casual wealth applied to captivity, the same abundance that had applied to everything else. And at the center of that abundance, the Jeep remained. Hartmann had seen American families driving around Fort Hood in civilian Jeeps now. Soldiers who had served in Europe buying surplus military vehicles and converting them for farm use, for hunting, for transportation. The Jeep was transitioning from military equipment to American icon, and Hartmann understood why. It represented everything America was: practical, reliable, unpretentious, effective, and available in endless quantities. Somewhere in Obergefreiter Klein's notes, which Hartmann had read while in prison camp, was a passage that summarized the entire truth. The Jeep showed us the cold mathematical reality we refused to acknowledge. That America could afford to make things simpler and better, that their abundance allowed them to waste resources in ways that improved reliability, that their industrial capacity meant they didn't need to optimize every component for maximum efficiency. They could afford to overbuild everything, and overbuilt simplicity defeated refined sophistication. 640,000 Jeeps produced by 1945, 50,000 Kubelwagens, a 12-to-1 ratio that told the entire story of the war. And the Jeeps had lasted longer, performed better, required less maintenance, and adapted to more roles than anyone had predicted. German officers had competed for them as trophies, had preferred them to German equipment, had relied on them in Germany's most desperate operations. General Dwight Eisenhower, in a speech Hartmann had read in an American newspaper, had called the Jeep one of the 5 pieces of equipment most vital to Allied victory. General George Marshall had characterized it as America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. These were not minor endorsements. These were the 2 men who had commanded American forces, acknowledging that a simple, crude, agricultural vehicle had been essential to defeating the Wehrmacht. Hartmann thought back to that day in May of 1942, standing in the Libyan desert, examining a captured jeep with contempt, confident in German superiority. He remembered the certainty he had felt, the unquestioned assumptions, the comfortable belief that sophistication would triumph over simplicity. He had been so wrong that the wrongness had a kind of majesty to it, a profound error that encompassed not just his personal judgment, but the entire philosophy of Nazi engineering and military planning. The Jeep sat in the sand that day, ugly and crude, and destined to change everything. And he had looked at it and seen nothing but confirmation of his prejudices. A guard called out that mail had arrived. Hartmann turned from the fence and walked toward the administration building. His boots. American-made, issued to prisoners because Germany had no boots to send, crunching on gravel. Tomorrow he would be processed for repatriation, returned to Germany to face whatever remained of his country. The war was over. The certainties were destroyed. And the Jeep, that ugly American machine, had been there at every step of his transformation, from confident superiority to humbled understanding. He wondered if the vehicle he had first examined at Gazala still existed somewhere, still functioning, still driving through terrain that shouldn't be passable. Probably it did. Those machines seemed indestructible. They would outlast the Reich that had underestimated them. In his journal that night, Hartmann wrote his final entry about the Jeep. We ridiculed it. We captured it. We studied it. We came to depend on it. And finally, we understood it. The American Jeep was not primitive, it was revolutionary. Not crude, but brilliantly simple. Not inferior, but perfectly adapted to the realities of modern industrial warfare. We learned this truth too late, when all our sophisticated engineering could not compensate for their overwhelming abundance. The Jeep taught us that wars are won not by the best equipment, but by good enough equipment produced in quantities that make perfection irrelevant. It is a bitter lesson learned in defeat, but perhaps the most important lesson this war has taught. He closed the journal and lay back on his cot. Outside, somewhere in the Texas night, he could hear the distant sound of vehicles on the highway. Trucks and cars and probably Jeeps. Always Jeeps, everywhere at once, the mechanical sound of American victory. The numbers tell the story that narratives cannot fully capture. Between 1941 and 1945, America produced approximately 640,000 Jeeps, 360,000 by Willys Overland, 280,000 by Ford. Germany produced roughly 50,000 Kübelwagens in the same period, a 12-to-1 production ratio that represented industrial capacity operating at scales that pre-war planners had considered impossible. But production numbers alone don't explain why the Jeep became iconic. The vehicle succeeded not because it was perfect, but because it was perfectly adapted to reality. Its four-wheel drive system with two-speed transfer case gave it capabilities that seemed impossible for such a light vehicle. Its 60-horsepower engine provided power margins that made it reliable in extreme conditions. Its standardized parts meant that any mechanic anywhere could repair it with components from any other Jeep. Its overbuilt simplicity meant it could be abused, neglected, driven through hell, and it would continue to function. German officers who fought against the Jeep became its most eloquent advocates after the war. Hans von Luck, who commanded a Panzer reconnaissance battalion in North Africa and later in Normandy, wrote in his memoirs that the Jeep was the only piece of American equipment that we respected without reservation. Otto Skorzeny, in post-war interviews, acknowledged that Operation Greif required American vehicles because only the Jeep could provide the combination of reliability, speed, and unremarkable appearance necessary for infiltration operations. The historian Charles K. Hyde summarized the Jeep's impact. In many respects, the Jeep became the iconic vehicle of World War II, with an almost mythological reputation for toughness, durability, and versatility. That mythology was built on documented reality. Jeeps climbed mountains, forded rivers, transported wounded, hauled artillery, delivered supplies, carried commanders, served as ambulances, acted as reconnaissance vehicles, pulled trailers, mounted weapons, laid communication lines, and did 1,000 other tasks that no single vehicle had ever been designed to accomplish. After the war, millions of surplus Jeeps flooded global markets. They became farm vehicles in Iowa, mail trucks in Australia, safari transports in Africa, mountain rescue vehicles in Switzerland. The design was copied without licensing by at least 20 countries, spawning variants that are still produced today. The Jeep transitioned from military equipment to cultural icon, appearing in films and photographs and advertisements as the symbol of American pragmatism and capability. Oberst Ludwig Hartmann returned to Germany in 1946 and spent his remaining years working as an industrial efficiency consultant, helping German companies rebuild their manufacturing capacity. He never served in military capacity again. In a 1963 interview for a German industrial magazine, he was asked what single lesson from the war had most influenced his post-war thinking. "The Jeep," he said simply. "That ugly, crude, simple American vehicle taught me that true efficiency isn't about sophistication or elegance. It's about reliability, maintainability, and producibility." The Americans understood something we didn't. In industrial competition, good enough in massive quantities defeats perfect in limited numbers. That principle applies to vehicles, weapons, consumer goods, everything. I learned it too late to help Germany win the war. But I've spent 20 years since applying it to help Germany rebuild. Hauptmann Friedrich Müller became a professor of mechanical engineering at Technical University of Munich, where he taught courses on design philosophy and industrial production. His lectures frequently referenced the Jeep as a case study in engineering humility, the recognition that clever complexity is often inferior to robust simplicity. When students would propose sophisticated solutions to design problems, Müller would ask, "Is this a Kübelwagen or a Jeep? Are you designing for elegance or reliability?" The Jeep that German generals ridiculed in 1942 became the vehicle they envied by 1943, depended on by 1944, and studied reverently after 1945. It was not the best vehicle ever designed. It was something more important. It was the right vehicle produced at the right time, in the right quantities, by a nation that understood industrial warfare in ways that Nazi Germany never grasped. Wars are not won by quality alone. They are won by the multiplication of adequate quality by overwhelming quantity. The Jeep embodied this mathematics. 640,000 vehicles, each one good enough, each one reliable enough, each one simple enough to be maintained by barely trained mechanics in impossible conditions. That was the genius the Germans missed when they first examined a captured Jeep at Gazala. That was the genius that won the war.